Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the All Might Be Edified discussions on servant leadership. I'm Keith Pankow, and I have the amazing privilege to be here with David Peter Stroh, who is the founding partner of Bridgeway Partners, which is a consulting firm that partners with mission-centered organizational leaders committed to advancing social and environmental transformation. He is internationally recognized for his work in enabling leaders to apply systems thinking to achieve breakthroughs around chronic, complex problems and to develop strategies which improve systems-wide performance over time. David has been described as a musician and the master at providing interesting and useful ways to look at complexity of systems thinking, who helped tremendously in getting at the core issues with some companies and with the mind of a scientist and the heart of a healer, as mentioned by others. Well, David, so excited to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Keith, for having me.
Yeah, I have to admit that I am familiar with David's work. And so when I got the invitation to have you on, I was ecstatic, very excited. You reference a lot of Peter Senge's work on systems thinking in your work and just the whole idea of systems thinking. One of my partners in my research, we talked about systems thinking. Just the two of us chatted about it in one episode, definitely at a much lower level, but we're fascinated about it. So I'm excited to get an even more in-depth discussion about it and to introduce people to your book, which is Systems Thinking for Social Change, a practical guide for solving complex problems, avoiding unintentional consequences, and achieving lasting results, which is a #1 bestseller. And so I definitely recommend it. I have it. I listened to it a little bit today. I was just going back through some of my notes on it and jotting some things down. So we're going to introduce the listeners to it a little bit today, and we'll talk about it. But where I really wanted to start today is on your website, which we'll link to on the show notes today with bridgewaypartners.com. And they give this 4-step set of tools to help people with getting them to thinking more systems thinking. And one of the things that you tell people is to place you or us as the central protagonist in the recognizable human story. And why is that so important to be that first step?
Well, that's a great question. And yes, very, very pivotal to this work. When people typically talk about systems, they talk about something out there, something beyond themselves. The system doesn't work. We have to change the system. And we actually end up separating ourselves from what it is we're trying to change, when in fact, we are part of the system. And to the extent that we're part of the system, we like to think, I'm part of it. Okay, that means I'm going to be part of the solution. But what we tend to forget is, and I love this quote from Bill Torbert, who was a professor emeritus of leadership at Boston College. He said, if you are not aware of how you are part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. What we tend to neglect is that actually the greatest control we have over these kind of huge systems, quote unquote, out there is by reflecting first on what are our own intentions, what is our own thinking, and what's our own behavior. We need to start with ourselves. And that's not necessarily easy to do. On the one hand, we say we have more control over that than we have trying to change everything out there. But I also found this quote from, some rock song in the last 5 years said, everybody wants to change the world. Nobody wants to change themselves. And you can't get there from here. So we need to be the central protagonist. We need to recognize how unwittingly we often tend to contribute to the very problems we're trying to solve. And if we can start there, then yes, we have a chance to create ripple effects that impact the larger systems that we're part of. But if we simply try to go about influencing out there without recognizing ourselves as part of it, we're not going to get very far.
I just love those thoughts. There's some really great thoughts in that. And I recently took a leadership class. It was geared to transform us from being everyday leaders and midline leaders to becoming senior leaders in our organization for us in the Coast Guard, but to get us leading change and leading policy and leading kind of more of the larger organization at scale. And one of the things that surprised me, and it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, is that there was intentionally a lot of self-reflection built into this course. And it was impressive to me because it was really deep, hard reflection. And so much so that I was exhausted each day because it really required me to take these steps to really look at myself, to put myself as the central protagonist in my own story, in my own leadership journey. And I think too often as we look at these issues, whatever it is we're trying to solve, whether it's me being a better leader or trying to gear my organization in a different way or change policies or even do change management in any simple way, I'm often looking at what I want to change without thinking about what my role in that is, like just like you said. And that self-reflection is absent in so many things that we do. And I used to think I was good at self-reflection until I went to that course and I realized for 2 solid weeks when I had to do it every single day at such a deep level and how exhausted I was, I realized I need better self-reflection practices. And so how do you encourage these listeners to think about what am I doing now for these self-reflection? What am I doing to be the central protagonist in this story? And how can I encourage myself to do better?
Great question. I tend to encourage people to start with something that they want to be different. They, as individuals, as groups, teams, organizations, have tried to make some change in the world and not progressed as far as they think they should be able to, given the resources that they put into it. And ask themselves the question, why, despite our best efforts, have we been unable to either move the needle substantially on this particular problem or achieve this particular goal? And that why question causes us to step back from what our favorite solutions are that we haven't been able to implement to maybe consider that we may not have the right solution because we don't understand the problem fully enough yet. And a related question then is, if we think we know the solution, why haven't we implemented it? And people go, whoa, it's because of them. It's because of them. Well, that's not going to get you anywhere. They're not going to change. Your current control, your current primary lever is yourself. So what are you, again, as an individual, as a team, an organization doing that might be getting in your way? Because one of the things is to recognize that systems behave in circular ways. We impact the world and then the world impacts us. And we kind of tend to end up focusing on one side of that or the other. You mentioned at the beginning of the show, Keith, people feeling so overwhelmed by the world around them. So they're very aware of how the world is impacting them, but they might not be particularly aware of how they're impacting the world. Or conversely, they might be very aware of what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to act on in the world, but they don't understand how what they do impacts the way the rest of the world operates, and then comes back and often can undermine or neutralize their best intentions to improve things. I encourage people to think in circles because the world actually is circular, not linear. When I was teaching this to some folks years ago and asked people to go off, do an exercise, think about some place you've been stuck for a while and whether these ways of thinking circularly could help you. So the people working on it, one person came back to me at the end of an hour or two and said, wow. And to think I've been going in circles on this for years. And I thought to myself, actually, the problem isn't so much that you've been going in circles, is that you haven't been aware of the circles that you've been going in. The only way to create a new circularity, a new cause and effect set of relationships is to first recognize the circles that you're in. And then you have a chance of stepping out of them and creating something different. We impact the world impacts us. How does that work in this particular situation that we're concerned about?
There's some really profound and deep thoughts there. And I really love how you started by saying something about how the solution that we think we have isn't working. And if we did have the solution, why haven't we implemented it yet? Because so many times, a lot of us will go into the situation, think we already have the solution set. And I remember so many times in my own doctorate program, that was the thing that we were reminded over and over again. Do not go into something thinking you already have the solution. First, diagnose the problem. Always diagnose the problem. And it goes back to that circular thinking. If you come into it with that solution prior to the problem set, you're always going to, you have to change that thought process before you go into it. And so many times, sometimes, understanding that problem set is that self-reflective thinking that also diagnoses how am I impacting the world around me? Well, I'm bringing my solution in before I even know the problem. And so I'm continuing to find solutions to things that don't have the problem is one way that I'm often can be infusing myself into that world. And a lot of times, when we bring in new leaders, we talked about in a previous episode with Frank Cespedes, where he talked about how you bring in these all-stars in sales and they've succeeded in another organization and they don't succeed in a new organization because it's a team evolution, but you think that this one person was the rock star. And so they don't succeed now. And you wonder, well, were they just not good? No, it's that you didn't count in those other factors. And the team, you didn't count in the environment. You didn't count in those other people that weren't necessarily, they were in the shadows a little bit more. And so it's so important to think about those things. And I just love the way you presented that, to be aware that you are thinking in circles. And so often the example came to mind as you were talking of being lost in the woods. And what do we know about people that get lost in the woods from my search and rescue background is that they walk in circles. And so they continue to walk.
Interesting. That's a great metaphor. Great analogy. Yeah.
And then, if you don't know you're lost and you continue to do that, you're going to continue to wear yourself out. You're going to get tired and you're going to get frustrated until you do something different, or you infuse that situation or become aware, or you bring into it. So just a wonderful thought.
The other thing that's tricky there, Keith, I would say, is systems have time delays in them. And what's deceptive about that is that often the consequences of our actions in the short term can be the opposite of what they are in the long term. So if it looks like we're making progress in the short term, that could be true, but it could be very deceptive. And we could be implementing some kind of quick fix that then creates longer term unintended consequences that either neutralize the benefits of what we do in the short term or make matters worse. So one example I often give is around homelessness, that homeless shelters provide temporary shelter for people, but they drain resources and motivation, political will, away from the more fundamental solution of permanent, supportive, affordable housing. So we need to, and the flip side is also true. If you want to accomplish something in the long term, you might have to invest and feel like you might even be going backwards or not moving very quickly in the short term in order to really be able to create the launching pad for the long-term success that you're looking for. So time plays into this as well, and these opposite impacts, short-term and long-term.
I just love that thought about having that delay. You have to account for that delay because we so often don't account for that delay. When I knew I was going to be speaking with you, I've been preparing the last couple of weeks. And a few days ago, I came across this graphic. It was about goal setting, actually. And it was interesting because it sparked some thoughts about my discussion with you. And it was about individual goal setting, but it talked about how when you put yourself in difficult situations, eventually you have this decline initially, but then you start to go up because there's this fear situation that you're afraid of the difficultness. But over time, that fear gets less and less because you get used to putting yourself in difficult situations. And I kind of wonder is if we could create this situation where we could help people understand systems thinking on a broader scale, if we could reduce that delay, if we could get people to reduce the amount of time to go backwards first. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. If we have so much of a time delay because it is part of the systems, or if it's because so often we don't understand systems thinking. And
I think there's somewhat of a both and there. I think we're in the US are very much a have it now culture. We don't appreciate time delay in the best sense of the word, that things take a while to really cultivate, to simmer, whatever it is, whatever metaphors we want to use. Gardening, it takes a while to grow that tree, etc. And we don't have a lot of patience in this society. And so I think part of it is changing our relationship to time so that we do cultivate more patience, that we are willing to be persistent, that we are willing to step back from the obvious quick fix to cultivate more effective progress over a period of time. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to show some kind of success in the short run, but that we want to do it in relation to a longer term strategy that we have in mind and a longer term aspiration that we have in mind. Now, sometimes you can actually shorten the delay and, just find a more efficient way to do it. And there may not be anything wrong with that. But more often than that, I think it's about cultivating patience and persistence and appreciation that the things do unfold over time if you stick with it.
I like that. That's a good thought. And I think it's well needed for a lot of us, develop that patience and persistence. And it goes back to, I think, putting ourselves in that situation to do hard things. I think this will cue up one of the things you talk about a lot in a lot of what you do. So why are people's good intentions to improve systems performance not enough to create change?
I offer quite a few examples actually at the beginning of the book, and I think it's worth kind of repeating some of those headlines. So one is homeless shelters perpetuate homelessness. Another one is that food aid increases starvation. Another one is that drug busts increase drug-related crime. Another one is that mass incarceration tends to increase people's fear of crime. I mean, these things seem like they're working totally backwards. And the reason is that systems do tend to respond to these short-term efforts to fix them in the direction that we want them to go. So that if you send food to people who are starving in the short term, they have something to eat. If you do drug busts in the short term, you take drugs off the street. So it seems like you're making progress, but then the secondary consequences come in over a period of time. What they found with food aid in developing countries is that when you send free food to a country, one of the things you're doing is you're undermining the local agricultural system because local farmers can't compete with free food. And so you're actually eroding the country's ability to feed itself over a period of time. There's a whole book called Toxic Charity, which is all about giving, but not empowering. Or we know about, giving people a fish rather than teaching them how to fish. And all of these different metaphors apply here. So what's deceptive about these good intentions is that we can often make progress in the short term and pat ourselves on the back and think we've got it handled. But then we tend to ignore these longer term consequences that, again, tend to make things worse or at best neutralize our initial efforts. And when the problem comes back, we don't tend to recognize our responsibility for the fact that the problem came back. We kind of assume, well, we took care of it. and it broke down somewhere else. And so some other part of the system is to blame for our good solutions not having worked, as opposed to coming back to that first conversation, part of the conversation we had where, oh, well, if it doesn't work, maybe I need to step back and figure out, did I miss something? Did I have an assumption that wasn't accurate? Systems today, let's say the homeless system in many cases is set up to help people cope with homelessness, but not end it. And I might say I'm about ending homelessness, but at the end of the day, what I'm doing is I'm kind of patching up the holes in the dike, and I'm not really digging deep to do what it takes to end it.
Yeah, these are tough issues. And so I have one question to kind of help us think about it in just a different way. And then I want to dig into deeper to how we begin to get ourselves situated to be on the other end, the solution of this, because I know that you help people set up that as well. And I'm going to shift us to just a different topic to help people realize that this is about all issues, not just homelessness. I know you write about all different issues, not just homelessness. And so I know you write a lot about climate change. And there's one thing that, in my mind, I think this is an issue that we just don't do a very good job of being systems thinker when it comes to climate change. And part of that's because so much of the talking points, whether it's politics or the media or social media, it gets hijacked by different talking points or conversations. And so it becomes easy to focus on things that aren't helpful for systems thinking altogether in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that I think gets totally lost is really the ethics of climate change, if you will, and just a broad way to say it, and what this really means when we start talking about having to reduce or shut down different types of power plants and move to different types of power sources, and what it means for, really global power supply and power outputs, and what it really different types of people and what power costs could mean, and toxic waste, and what we've done in the past to ship that waste to other people, and how there's been a burden on developing countries and different things. And we really don't talk about this whole power distribution as a holistic system. And I think we really kind of sell it short when we talk about what's needed for climate change. And I think if we had a more holistic conversation, we'd see just why we need to do so much more as a developed nation than what we are doing. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a macro and a micro. And the macro is along the lines of what you're talking about. What is this wonderful observation? If you have more power, you have more responsibility. And to the extent that we do have more resources, more power in not just an energy sense, but a resource sense overall, we have more responsibility to help the world around us. And it does come back and bite us if we don't. So the immigrant crisis on the southern border is partly a result of decisions that our governments and our companies made over the years that extracted resources from Central America and left people there more vulnerable, more hopeless, and more determined to come to the U.S. The forests that were destroyed, the grazing land that was destroyed, and so on, made it harder for people to make a living in their home countries. And so we now have a border crisis. But it's not because of them in and of itself. It's because of our tendencies to try to, and this is a problem with a lot of capitalism, is that it's extractive by nature. And the people who get hurt are going to come back and try to hurt you. Or they're not even going to try to hurt you. They're going to try to do things to take care of themselves that are going to then make your life more difficult. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to survive. So that's kind of big macro stuff. And then if we go back to that theme of personal responsibility, turns out that two of the greatest levers for reducing climate change are food decisions that we make. What do we eat? And, the dependence on meat, for example, which produces a lot more pollution, unless it's grass-fed, which, at this point is still more expensive and so on. And it's in the amount of food that we waste. Food waste is considered like the second or third highest cause of climate change, in the sense that there's the costs that go into the agriculture and the chemicals and the destruction of the soil. There are the transportation costs. And then we stuff the food in our refrigerator, forget about 40% of it, and throw it out. Or I think it's 25% in the individual home. It's 40% overall, including restaurants and supermarkets. That's huge. It's a huge waste of energy. And we tend to assume that climate change serious climate action will only take place if corporations change and if governments change. But we tend to neglect the choices that we make as individuals. And the more we can do in our own homes, in our own communities, in our purchasing decisions, in the communications we have with political officials and with companies, those can have an impact, because if all of us do it, or a larger percentage of us did that, it would add up. All those small actions, those small intentions, those small decisions would add up and send signals to that larger economic and political environment that couldn't be ignored. So to me, it's a both and, but we can't ignore the individual and the smaller actions.
I just love the way you just transitioned that to putting us all back as the central protagonists in the human story there, because now we all have a way to be an agent, to act now, to be mindful about our purchasing power, how we're using our resources, how we're acting. And I remember when I was at LSU doing environmental science, they talked a lot about how we, we're more resource mindful about not even just the food that we use, but how we're heating our home and how we're insulating our homes and
Right.
These different things, this energy loss is a big deal. And so, we don't realize all of these resources we're just wasting, not just food, but energy that's just wasted on a regular basis. And that has that's a big amount of energy if we really calculate it at all, especially if we look at most of our homes in the southern United States, the central air conditioning all is ducted through the attic. And none of it's insulated. So most of our air conditioning is all energy loss. And that's just one way we think.
Right.
Let's go another way to look. And that's another way.
And my partner, Marilyn Paul, is actually working on a project now that is about building from the individual out. And she calls it's hard to save the planet when you don't know what to do. And there's a statistic, I think, coming out of Yale Research Center that 73% of Americans are concerned about climate change and 8% report doing something about it. That is a huge, huge gap. And people say they don't take action because they don't know what to do. They don't know what has the greatest leverage. And she points out that, there are tons of lists about what to do and where the leverage is. To move from just awareness of all those good ideas to taking action requires some personal steps, some personal reflection, recognition, by the way, that it's not all about sacrifice, that there are enormous satisfactions to be gained from taking your particular passions, your particular strengths, and applying them to whatever those areas of leverage are, to recognizing that ultimately there's more fulfillment in connecting with people and with nature than there is in having more stuff. And there's all sorts of ways of accessing this. And that's something she has a real passion for.
Oh, I love that. There's some power in that. How can we engage more effectively with others and seeing the reality of others from their perspective, and then use that to help close that gap, to take these ideas and see the perspectives of other people as their realities, and then close that gap, that 73% and 8, and close that gap. Take the realities of other people and and learn from them, but see the realities and close that gap.
If we stay with the climate conversation, there are some very interesting community groups out there that have formed specifically around taking climate action together. Neighborhood groups, city groups, and that's what they do. They get together, they compare notes on what they're doing individually, they share tips with each other and inspire each other. They start thinking about projects like creating parkland where it wasn't before, or growing trees in parts of the city that are very heavy with concrete, which of course is horrible as the air heats up. So there are all sorts of things that people can do together, but it starts with, this is something that is important to me that I want to do more about. And I start talking to other people. I see what else is out there. My wife and I were just at a local center called the Ecology Center. It's just like blocks down the street from us. And they have this huge project in California to connect farmers in California, local farmers, with people who need food. And they've hooked it up with government subsidies, with networks of farmers and farmers markets. And you can bring, chits to a farmer's market and it'll be recognized by the farmers and you'll get fresh food coming out of that, because obviously fresh food is very hard to get in poor neighborhoods. So that's an example where this very small organization is having a huge impact on a statewide basis, formally. But of course, people in other states find out about it and consult with them and start their own state chapters of it and so on. And so what looks like a very small organization can have a huge impact. And that's all, it starts with community interest and awareness and dollars.
I love it. And I want to use that as the challenge for this episode is think about it. Think about how you can be the protagonist of your own story, and think about where you can start to make a change in something that matters to you. And think about those around you and their perspectives and help them begin to be the protagonist of their story and make a change that matters to them. And that's how we start. That's how this begins to change. And so that's how people begin to think in systems and begin to make more and more changes that will better the world. Now, David, you have so many more things, and we could probably go on like 10 episodes and talk about so many things. So I really want you to kind of go onto the macro level a little bit more and talk about your 4-stage process for leading systems change, because I think just to give the listeners an overview of what that really looks like, to give them a little bit more guidance on that as they get a little further on their path of systems change.
Sure. So if we're working again at the organizational level, or could be a multi-stakeholder group in a community. So you'd have, for example, representatives of the private sector, of the public sector, civic organizations, nonprofits, and so on. It starts with building some foundation for change, getting the different stakeholders together and having them do really 3 things. The first is to find out what is their common ground, what is their shared aspiration. Is it they want to address homelessness, they want to address climate change in their communities, whatever it is. And also to take at least an initial snapshot of where they are now. What is the current reality that they can collectively identify that stands in contrast to where they want to be? The third step is to start building some relationships and some capacity to think systemically, to think in terms of connectivity, and to build some skills for productive conversations around difficult issues. How do we take ownership of our own assumptions? How do we really listen effectively? Things that sound so basic, but in the heat of the moment can be very, very difficult to implement. So all of this is about foundation building, and the end goal of foundation building is that people individually and collectively feel ready to make a change. The second stage is to dig deeper into the current reality part of this, because we can all agree perhaps on what is going on, but it's very interesting if you dig deeper and ask the question, why do we have the current reality we have? People will come up with very, very different answers. And usually the answer, the fact that we have the problems we do is because of some other part of the system that isn't doing their thing, what they should be doing. And with all that finger pointing, it's very, very hard to make progress. So digging deeper into the root causes of the gaps that we're trying to bridge, the problems that we're trying to solve, will make us all that more effective and really develop a longer term way of thinking about it and not just dig down into quick fixes. We also discover when we dig deeper into current reality, the payoffs to the way things are. As dysfunctional as systems appear, if you take a look at it, there's always some payoff to the way things are. Again, in the homelessness situation, shelters, you might say, they're not really getting us where we want to go. But fact of the matter is there's a shelter system. It's funded. People are employed in that system. You temporarily get people off the street. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why that system, as dysfunctional as it is, continues to exist. The third step is to make a choice. Because what you inevitably find as you dig deeper into the underlying causes of a problem is that there are not only benefits of changing it, but there are also these payoffs to why it persists. And usually we're going to have to come to some kind of trade-off. Obviously, we'd love to have a both and. We'd love to have the best of both, the way it is and the way we want it to be. But more often than not, we're going to have to make some choices. Which is more important to us? And one of the analogies I give is marriage. We're making compromises in a marriage because there's benefits to the partnership that we can't get if we're just living life as if we were individuals. So we're willing to give up, doing things exactly our way, exactly on our own schedules if we were alone because of the benefits that we get from being in a partnership. And the same is true at other levels of system, but it requires a choice. Am I more committed in this case to the partnership and willing to back off on an individual preference because it's not a showstopper or not? And once we get through that third stage of looking at trade-offs and really choosing what it is that we say we want to accomplish with the trade-offs consciously there for us to decide. And then we can move into the fourth stage, which is about quote unquote solutions, leverage points, and continuous learning. Recognizing that even as we start bridging the gap and taking actions, life is going to change. We'll learn more, and we're going to be continuously adjusting.
Well, I love it. And that's just a real short synopsis of so many things that are talked about so well in your book, Systems Thinking for Social Change, a practical guide for solving complex problems, avoiding unintended consequences, and achieving lasting results, which once again is a #1 bestseller, but I can't recommend it enough. Definitely go out and get it if you haven't seen it. There's so many more things that are talked about in there. And many of us novices, it's great, but even for those that are highly skilled change makers, it'll help you get closer to your goals, as we've talked about. And what I really love is the skill that I garnished really good from the book that we've talked a little bit about, or glossed over, I should say, that we haven't dived into, which I would love to come back and talk about one day, is how you acknowledge so well these things that you, in these systems that you're just willing to accept, even though that system's not working perfectly, like you mentioned, homeless shelters, that there's benefits that are happening, there's employment that's happening, there's these parts of the systems that are happening, whether it's, you talk a lot about prisons or, recidivism rates and different things in crime, and you have wonderful statistics and different descriptions in your book. And, looking back at that, there's things in that system that we just accept. And it's hard to get past it because there's lots of parts of that system that are working for some people. And even though they're not working for others. And I really, it helps me to think about that when I go to do my self-reflection now, to stop and think, what is working for me that might not be working for others? Or what is working for others that might not be working for me? Because that's helped me kind of set myself up for a better conversation. And so I throw that out there because that's a tangible skill that I've gained from the book that I really just appreciate, David. And I just wanted to throw that out there. And I'm so glad I got to chat with you today. Any final comments to wrap us up today?
There's a lot you can do and a lot more than you think you can do. And it's worth it.
What a beautiful phrase. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks so much for all of you listening. I hope you've been edified. I've been edified. And thanks again for listening to That All Might Be Edified, Discussions on Servant Leadership, and have a wonderful day.